3 knocks, then silence, then 3 more, slower this time, weaker. Dale pressed his ear against the cold metal door and knew someone was still alive down there, barely. For a week, the porch light on Sycamore Street had burned through mornings it shouldn't have. For a week, nobody noticed. Nobody except the biker the whole street had spent 11 years crossing the road to avoid. He grabbed the bolt cutters from his truck without waiting for permission, without waiting for police, without waiting for anyone to tell him it wasn't his business. What he found at the bottom of those stairs would change how an entire neighborhood saw him and expose exactly who had locked that door and why. Dale Whitfield had lived on Sycamore Street for 11 years, and in that time, he had learned exactly how much space a neighborhood was willing to give a man like him. It wasn't much. He kept his lawn trimmed better than anyone else on the block, washed his truck every Saturday, and waved at every mail carrier who ever walked past his porch. But none of that mattered. Once people saw the leather vest, the faded ink running down his forearms, or the black Harley parked in his driveway, like a threat nobody had actually made. He was 42 years old, built like a man who had worked with his hands his whole life because he had. Dale ran a small motorcycle repair shop off Charlotte Pike, the kind of place with a bell over the door and a coffee pot that never quite got cleaned. He was a patched member of the Iron Watch Motorcycle Club, a group Nashville locals had decided, without ever asking a single member a single question, was dangerous. Rumors did what rumors do. They grew teeth. The truth was duller than the rumors. Iron Watch spent more time doing toy drives at Christmas and escorting funeral processions for fallen veterans than anything resembling the trouble people imagined. But trouble made a better story than kindness. And so the story stuck to Dale like exhaust smoke, following him into the grocery store, the hardware store, the pharmacy, wherever he went. Karen Sutton lived 4 houses down, in the tidy brick colonial with the American flag that never seemed to fade. She was 55, recently retired from decades as a school administrator, and she ran her end of Sycamore Street the way she'd once run a front office. She knew who came and went, who mowed on schedule, and who didn't belong. For years, Dale had fallen into that last category in her mind. She'd complained about his motorcycle's engine noise at a neighborhood meeting once. She'd steered her grandchildren to the opposite sidewalk when he was out front. Then there was Harold Bennett. Harold was 78 years old and had lived at the corner of Sycamore and 5th for nearly 40 years, ever since he and his late wife Eleanor bought the house with the wraparound porch and the oak tree that dropped acorns onto the driveway every fall. Eleanor had passed 6 years earlier. Since then, Harold had kept mostly to himself, tending a small vegetable garden in the backyard, sitting on that porch most evenings with a glass of sweet tea, and trading a nod with Dale whenever their paths crossed. Harold was one of the only people on the street who ever looked Dale in the eye and said good morning like he meant it. "You're the only one who ever waves back at that boy," Eleanor had told Harold once, years before she died, watching Dale ride past. "Everybody else acts like he's going to rob the church. People decide what they want to see," Harold had said. "I'd rather decide for myself." That had stuck with Dale in the quiet way small kindnesses do. He didn't know Harold well. A few conversations about lawn mowers, a borrowed ladder once, a wave most mornings, but he'd come to think of the old man as one of the few genuine souls on the block, the kind of person whose decency wasn't a performance. Harold's nephew, Craig Dobson, had moved into the guest room 8 months earlier, after Harold's hip surgery left him needing help around the house. Craig was 39, Harold's late sister's son, and on the surface, the arrangement looked like family taking care of family. Neighbors saw Craig mowing Harold's lawn sometimes, saw his car in the driveway, and assumed the old man was being looked after. Dale wasn't so sure. He'd seen Craig a handful of times, and something about the man's manner always struck him wrong. The way Craig's eyes moved when he talked, calculating rather than present, the way he referred to Harold's house as my inheritance once, laughing like it was a joke when nobody else was laughing. Dale had mentioned it to his shop partner, Nathan Reyes, in passing. Nathan had shrugged. Family was family, not their business. Then, on a Tuesday in late September, Dale noticed that Harold's porch light hadn't been turned off in 2 straight mornings. That wasn't like him. Harold was a man of routine. Porch light off by 7, newspaper retrieved by 7:15, coffee on the porch by 7:30. Dale mentioned it to nobody. It wasn't his place. He told himself that twice on his way to work both mornings, and didn't quite believe it either time. By Thursday, the newspapers had piled up at the end of Harold's driveway, 4 of them now, curling in the September heat. The garden, usually weeded and watered by Harold's own hand every evening, had started to wilt. Dale slowed his motorcycle as he passed that afternoon, studying the house. The curtains were drawn tight. Craig's car was still in the driveway, but there was no sign of Harold, no porch light ritual, no sweet tea, no wave. It was Karen Sutton, of all people, who noticed something was truly wrong. She'd been walking her dog past Harold's house every evening for a week, and on that Thursday she caught something she couldn't shake, a faint, muffled sound from beneath the house, near the old storm cellar door on the side of the foundation, a knocking, rhythmic, human. She stood frozen on the sidewalk for a long moment, her dog straining at the leash, her mind racing through every reasonable explanation. A pipe, an animal, a television left on too loud somewhere. None of them fit. She knocked on Harold's front door. No answer. She tried Craig's cell phone, a number she'd gotten once for a lawn care question. It went straight to voicemail. Karen stood on that sidewalk with her phone in her hand, running through the people she could call. The police felt like an overreaction for a sound she couldn't fully explain. Craig wasn't answering. Harold had no other family nearby that she knew of. Then she thought of Dale. She wasn't sure, later, why he was the name that came to her first. The biker she'd spent years side-eyeing from behind her curtains. The man she'd once described to a neighbor as a lot of trouble waiting to happen. But some instinct underneath all her assumptions told her that if something was actually wrong, he was the kind of person who would act immediately and without hesitation and worry about the rest afterward. She found his number in the neighborhood contact sheet nobody used anymore, the one from a community meeting 2 years back. Her hand hesitated over the call button for exactly 3 seconds, then she pressed it. Dale was closing up the shop when his phone rang, an unfamiliar Nashville number that he almost let go to voicemail. Something made him answer. "Is this Dale? Dale Whitfield?" The woman's voice was tight, unfamiliar with itself, like she wasn't used to asking anyone for help. "This is Karen Sutton. I live on Sycamore, near Harold Bennett's place. I don't know who else to call." Dale's grip on the phone tightened at the mention of Harold's name. "What's wrong?" "I don't know exactly. I heard something, a knocking sound coming from under his house by the storm cellar. He hasn't been seen in days. The papers are piling up, his nephew's not answering his phone, and I just—" She stopped herself. "This is going to sound crazy." "It doesn't," Dale said, already grabbing his keys. "I'm 5 minutes out." He didn't ask her why she'd called him instead of the police. He'd think about that later. Right now, all he could think about was Harold's porch light, burning through 2 mornings it shouldn't have, and a knocking sound underneath a house where an old man who'd never once looked at him with suspicion was supposed to be safe. He arrived on Sycamore Street in under 6 minutes, cutting his engine half a block early so the neighborhood wouldn't hear him coming and assume the worst before he'd done anything at all. Karen was waiting on the sidewalk in front of Harold's house, arms crossed tight over her chest, her dog sitting obediently but alert beside her. "Over there," she said, pointing to the low, weathered storm cellar door built into the side of the foundation, half hidden by an overgrown hydrangea bush. I heard it right before I called you, knocking, like someone hitting metal with something. Dale walked to the door and crouched beside it, pressing his ear to the cold metal. For a moment, nothing. Then it came. 3 slow knocks, followed by a pause, followed by 3 more. Deliberate. A pattern. Someone was signaling on purpose. "Harold!" Dale called, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through him. "Harold, it's Dale from down the street. Can you hear me?" The knocking came again, faster now, more urgent, and beneath it, faint but unmistakable, a man's voice, hoarse and thin. "Help! Someone, please!" Dale's stomach dropped. He grabbed the cellar door handle and pulled. Locked from the outside, with a heavy padlock that looked newer than everything else on the structure. Bright brass against rusted hinges, the kind of lock someone had installed recently and deliberately. "Karen, call 911 now," Dale said, already moving toward his truck for the toolbox he kept behind the seat. "Tell them a medical emergency. Elderly man trapped. Address here on Sycamore." Karen, who 10 minutes earlier had been ready to write the whole situation off as a plumbing noise, was already dialing with hands that shook only slightly. Dale returned with a set of bolt cutters he kept for shop emergencies, the kind of steel shearing tool he never expected to use outside his own garage. He set the jaws around the padlock's shackle and threw his full weight into the handles. It took 3 attempts before the lock gave way with a sharp metallic crack. He hauled the cellar door open. The smell hit him first. Stale air, sweat, and something worse underneath it, the smell of a body that had been without proper food or water for too long. He grabbed the small flashlight from his truck and swept it down the narrow concrete stairs into the darkness. "Harold!" At the bottom of the stairs, propped against the wall beside a rusted furnace and a stack of old paint cans, was Harold Bennett. He looked 30 pounds lighter than the man Dale had waved to a week earlier. His skin had gone grey, his lips cracked, his eyes struggling to focus in the sudden light. He was wearing the same shirt Dale remembered from the previous Tuesday. Beside him sat an empty plastic water jug, clearly rationed to the last careful drop, and a broken piece of pipe he'd apparently been using to bang against the metal door, over and over, for however many hours he'd had the strength to do it. "Dale," Harold rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "You came. You actually came." "I'm here." Dale was already down the stairs, kneeling beside him, checking his pulse with 2 fingers pressed to his throat, feeling the thready but present rhythm beneath the old man's papery skin. "I've got you. You're okay. Help's coming." "Craig," Harold whispered. "Craig locked it. Told me it was for my own safety. Said I'd been wandering. I wasn't wandering, Dale. I went down for the ladder. He shut the door behind me. I heard the padlock." His voice broke apart into a fit of dry, rattling coughs. Dale felt something cold settle into his chest, a fury he hadn't expected and didn't have time to process. "Don't talk. Save it. Just breathe." Above them, sirens were already growing louder down Sycamore Street, and Karen stood at the top of the cellar stairs, with her phone still in her hand, staring down into the darkness where Dale Whitfield, the man she'd spent years quietly deciding was dangerous, knelt beside a dying old man, holding his hand and telling him over and over that he was going to be all right. She hadn't expected to feel ashamed standing there. She'd expected relief, maybe, or fear, or the numb shock of an ordinary evening turning into an emergency. Instead, watching Dale's hands move with practiced calm, checking Harold's pulse, elevating his legs slightly, keeping his voice low, and even the way someone trained for exactly this kind of moment would, she felt something closer to humiliation. She had lived 4 houses away from this man for over a decade, and had never once bothered to learn that he knew first aid, or that his voice could carry that particular steadiness, the kind that came only from having used it before, in worse circumstances than this one. "How do you know to do that?" she asked quietly. more to herself than to him. 2 tours overseas, before the shop, Dale said without looking up, still focused on Harold. You learn to keep people calm and keep them breathing. Everything else can wait. It was such a small piece of information tossed off without weight, but it landed on Karen like a stone. 11 years, and she'd never known that either. By the time the paramedics reached the bottom of those stairs, Dale had given Harold sips of water from his own bottle, wrapped him in the jacket off his back despite the September warmth, because shock made a body feel cold no matter the weather, and kept talking to him in a low, steady voice about nothing in particular. The weather, the garden, anything to keep him tethered and conscious until help arrived. You're going to make it, Dale told him. You hear me? You're going to make it. Harold's eyes found his, glassy but present. Never doubted you'd come, he whispered. Never doubted it for a second. Harold Bennett was rushed to Vanderbilt University Medical Center, severely dehydrated, his kidneys under significant strain, his body temperature dangerously low from a week spent on cold concrete. The paramedics told Dale, as they loaded the stretcher into the ambulance, that another day, maybe 2, might have been the difference between a hospital bed and a funeral home. Dale followed the ambulance in his truck, calling Nathan from the road to close up the shop for him. He sat in the Vanderbilt waiting room for 4 hours before a nurse finally told him Harold was stable, resting, and would likely recover fully with time and monitoring. Dale exhaled for what felt like the first time all evening and sank into a plastic chair, his hands still faintly trembling from the adrenaline that had carried him through the last several hours. Karen Sutton arrived at the hospital not long after, having followed the ambulance in her own car once the police finished taking her initial statement on Sycamore Street. She found Dale in the waiting room, elbows on his knees, staring at nothing. They said he's going to be okay, she said, sitting 2 chairs away, close enough to talk, far enough to still feel like strangers. That's what they told me, too. Dale rubbed a hand over his face. Thank you for calling. For calling me, I mean. Karen was quiet for a moment. I almost didn't. I stood there on the sidewalk trying to think of literally anyone else. She let out a short, humorless laugh. That's a hell of a thing to admit to your face. I'd rather you say it than not, Dale said. At least it's honest. I've lived 4 houses down from you for 11 years, Karen said. I've complained about your motorcycle at 2 neighborhood meetings. I steered my grandkids across the street when you were out front working on that bike, like you were going to do something to them just by existing. And when the moment actually mattered, when something was actually wrong, you're the first person I thought of. Not the police, not my own neighbors, you. She shook her head slowly. I don't know what to do with that. Dale didn't answer right away. He'd heard versions of this apology before, in smaller doses. A woman in the grocery store once thanking him for holding a door and looking surprised at her own gratitude. A cop who'd pulled him over for no clear reason and seemed disappointed when the stop turned up nothing. He'd learned not to expect the moment to change much of anything. People's fear had a way of resetting itself once the crisis passed. You don't have to do anything with it, he said finally. You made the right call tonight. That's what matters. It shouldn't have taken this to see it, Karen said quietly. Meanwhile, Nashville Metro Police had already tracked down Craig Dobson, locating him at a bar off Charlotte Avenue, less than 2 miles from his uncle's house, where he'd been for most of the evening, while Harold lay trapped beneath the floorboards of his own home. Detective Ellen Marsh, assigned to the case, arrived at the bar with 2 uniformed officers and found Craig 3 drinks into an evening that, according to the bartender, he'd spent talking loudly about an inheritance he expected any day now. Craig's story, when questioned, shifted twice before settling into something resembling an explanation. He claimed Harold had been getting confused, wandering at odd hours, and that locking the cellar door had been a temporary safety measure while Craig figured out a longer-term care plan. He claimed he'd meant to check on his uncle that morning and simply forgotten, distracted by work. He claimed when the timeline made a full day's forgetting implausible, that he'd assumed a neighbor would look in eventually. Detective Marsh had worked enough elder neglect cases to recognize the shape of the story he was building. The brass padlock, purchased new according to a receipt later found in Craig's car, told a version of the truth Craig hadn't planned on being found. A hardware store 2 miles from Harold's house confirmed the purchase, dated the same day Harold had last been seen tending his garden. Craig was arrested that night on charges of elder abuse and false imprisonment, with additional charges pending review by the district attorney's office once Harold's condition allowed him to give a full statement. Detective Marsh spent the following morning walking the scene at Harold's house with a forensic technician, photographing the cellar stairs, the empty water jug, the bent length of pipe Harold had used to signal for help. She noted in her report the deliberateness of the setup, food left in the kitchen upstairs, untouched, while Harold had been given nothing below. A battery-powered lantern in the cellar that had been removed, leaving him in near total darkness for the better part of a week. Small details, each one suggesting a level of calculation that went beyond neglect. Marsh had seen plenty of families fail their elderly relatives through exhaustion, poverty, or simple carelessness. This felt different. This felt intentional, built one convenient excuse at a time. She requested Harold's medical and financial records that same afternoon, along with a subpoena for Craig's bank statements, already suspecting the shape the case would eventually take. The story broke locally within 2 days. A nephew who'd locked his elderly uncle in a basement for a week, an old man rationing water and banging a pipe against a metal door with the last of his strength, and a motorcycle club member the neighborhood had spent years distrusting who'd been the one to answer the call and break the lock himself. The Sycamore Street Facebook group, the same one that had once hosted a thread about Dale's motorcycle noise levels running to 43 comments, filled instead with a different kind of conversation. Neighbors who had never spoken a word to Dale in 11 years began posting his name with something between guilt and gratitude. A few reached out directly, awkward messages thanking him, apologizing without quite using the word. Dale read most of them and didn't respond to many. It wasn't gratitude he was looking for. He'd have broken that lock whether anyone was watching or not, whether the story made the news or stayed buried on a quiet street nobody outside it would ever hear about. That had never been the point. But something in him, some old and worn-down part that had absorbed 11 years of sideways glances and crossed streets, noticed the shift anyway. He didn't trust it yet. He'd learned the hard way that a neighborhood's memory was short, and its instincts, once formed, tended to snap back into their old shapes the moment the crisis faded from view. Harold's recovery, once it began, moved faster than the doctors had initially predicted. Within 4 days, his kidney function had stabilized, and though he remained weak and required a walker to move around his hospital room, the color had returned to his face and the sharpness to his eyes. Dale visited twice, sitting in the vinyl chair beside the bed, mostly listening while Harold talked through what he remembered of that week in fragments. The sound of his own voice going hoarse from calling for help, the way he'd rationed the water jug into smaller and smaller sips as the days wore on, the moment on the 6th day when he'd stopped believing anyone would find him and started praying instead that it would be quick. "I thought about Eleanor a lot down there," Harold admitted on Dale's second visit, his voice still rough but steadier now. "Kept thinking, if this is it, at least I'll see her again. Strange thing to find peace in. But there it was." "You didn't need it," Dale said. "You made it. Because you came." Harold's eyes, sharp, despite everything his body had been through, fixed on Dale's face. "I want you to understand something. I've watched this street treat you like a stray dog for 11 years, cross the road, pull their kids close, whisper behind their hands. And when it came down to it, when it actually mattered, not one of them so much as noticed I was gone. It was you. It was always going to be you. Dale looked down at his hands, uncomfortable in a way he rarely let himself be. Karen's the one who heard you. She's the one who called. Karen called because some part of her knew who to trust when it counted, Harold said. That's not nothing, but you're the one who broke the lock. Don't hand that away because you're not used to people saying thank you and meaning it. The criminal case against Craig Dobson moved forward through the following weeks. Harold, once he was strong enough, gave a full statement to Detective Marsh, describing a pattern that had been building for months before the cellar incident. Craig pressuring him to sign over power of attorney, Craig growing sharp and irritable whenever Harold mentioned wanting to stay in his own home rather than move to assisted living, Craig's increasingly open comments about the house's value and what he planned to do with it eventually. The padlock, it turned out, hadn't been an isolated act of cruelty, but the culmination of 8 months of quiet, calculated pressure. A nephew who had moved in under the guise of caregiving and instead spent those months positioning himself for an inheritance he didn't want to wait for. A search of Craig's laptop, conducted under warrant, revealed browser history researching how long a person could survive without water. Searches conducted the same week Harold went missing. The district attorney's office upgraded the charges once that evidence surfaced. What had begun as elder abuse and false imprisonment now moved toward something closer to attempted murder, a possibility that made the local news coverage sharper, more sustained, and impossible for Sycamore Street to look away from. Dale found himself, somewhat to his own discomfort, at the center of that coverage. A local news crew showed up outside his shop asking for an interview. He declined twice before Nathan finally convinced him that saying nothing would let other people finish the story for him badly. You don't have to make it a speech, Nathan told him. Just tell them what happened. Let people see you did what anybody decent would have done if they'd bothered to listen when it mattered. Jai Durhin. Nathan had worked beside Dale at the shop for 6 years and had heard, second-hand, most of what Sycamore Street thought of his business partner. The assumptions people made from a distance, the way conversations sometimes died when Dale walked into a room he wasn't expected in. He'd watched Dale absorb all of it, without much comment over the years, the same way he absorbed a bad diagnosis on an engine, patiently, methodically, without wasting energy on the unfairness of it. It had always struck Nathan as more than most people could manage. You know, this doesn't erase 11 years, Nathan added, quieter now. One interview, one good deed. People forget in a month if you let them. I'm not doing it so they remember, Dale said. I'm doing it so Harold's story gets told right. That's the only reason. Dale gave the interview standing in front of his shop, his voice steady, his answers short. He didn't talk about 11 years of cross streets or whispered assumptions. He talked about Harold, his garden, his sweet tea, the nod he gave every morning that never once made Dale feel like a stranger on his own street. He talked about Karen's phone call and the courage it took her to make it, given everything she'd have had reason to assume about whether he'd answer. People decide what they want to see, Dale said, echoing words he didn't know Harold had once said to Eleanor, words that had somehow found their way to him anyway, carried on the current of a decency that outlasted the person who'd first spoken them. I'd just ask people to look a little longer before they decide. The clip ran on the local evening news and then, unexpectedly, spread further, picked up by a regional outlet, then shared widely enough that Dale started getting messages from strangers outside Nashville entirely, people who'd read about the biker who broke a padlock to save a man's life, while an entire street watched from behind their curtains. Craig Dobson, meanwhile, sat in the Davidson County Jail awaiting trial, his bail set high enough by the judge, who cited the calculated nature of the crime and the flight risk posed by a defendant facing serious charges, that he had little hope of returning to Harold's house before a verdict was reached, if he returned at all. Harold Bennett was discharged from Vanderbilt 3 weeks after Dale broke the padlock on his cellar door. He returned to the house on Sycamore Street thinner than before, moving carefully with a cane the doctors recommended for at least a few more months, but alive, and by every measure that mattered, himself again. The neighborhood organized what Karen Sutton somewhat sheepishly called a welcome home, though everyone understood it was really an apology dressed up as a party. Folding tables appeared on Harold's front lawn. Casseroles and sweet tea and a banner someone had made that simply read, "Welcome home, Harold." Neighbors who hadn't spoken 2 words to him in years showed up with covered dishes and careful, guilty smiles. Dale almost didn't go. He'd never felt entirely comfortable at gatherings on a street that had spent over a decade making its discomfort with him plain, and some old, tired part of him expected that discomfort to resurface the moment the crisis fully faded and people no longer needed a hero to feel better about what they'd failed to notice. It was Harold who called him personally the morning of, his voice stronger now than it had been in weeks. "If you're not standing on my lawn by 4 o'clock, I'm sending Karen to fetch you on foot, and you know she'll do it." Dale showed up at 3:45, still in his work clothes, feeling distinctly out of place among the pressed shirts and church dresses the rest of the street had put on for the occasion. Harold spotted him from his chair on the porch and waved him over immediately, refusing to let him linger at the edge of the crowd the way Dale had planned to. "Everybody," Harold said, loud enough to cut through the scattered conversations on the lawn, his cane planted firmly, his voice carrying the same steadiness Dale remembered from all those quiet mornings trading nods across the street. "This is Dale Whitfield. Most of you know his name by now from the news, but I want you to know it from me, too. I'm standing here today because he didn't wait for anybody's permission to care. He didn't wait to see if I was the kind of person worth the trouble. He just came." The lawn went quiet. Karen Sutton stood near the front of the small crowd, her dog sitting obediently at her feet, and Dale caught her eye for just a moment. She gave him a small nod, the kind that meant more than any of the awkward thank you messages that had filled his phone over the past 3 weeks. "I've lived on this street for 40 years, Harold continued. "Longer than most of you have been here. And in all that time, I never had a single neighbor cross to the other sidewalk to avoid me. Never had anybody whisper behind my back or decide who I was based on what I looked like riding down the road. Dale had that happen to him every single day for 11 years. On this street, from people standing on this lawn right now. And when it came down to it, when I was lying on cold concrete for a week, banging a pipe against a door, with what little strength I had left, none of the people who'd been so certain about him ever came looking. He's the one who came. I think that tells you something worth sitting with. Nobody on the lawn quite knew where to look." Dale, uncomfortable under the weight of every eye now turned toward him, finally spoke, his voice quiet but carrying in the stillness Harold's words had left behind. "I didn't do anything special," he said. "I heard somebody needed help and I went. That's it. That's the whole thing. I don't need a speech for it, and I don't need this street to feel bad about 11 years of crossing the road either. What I'd ask, if I'm asking anything, is that next time somebody around here looks different than you expect, you remember this. That's all. Just remember it." Karen stepped forward from the small crowd, her voice steady despite the flush rising in her cheeks. "I want to say something too, if that's all right." She looked at Dale directly. "I complained about you at 2 neighborhood meetings. I told my own grandchildren to be careful around you, like you were something dangerous instead of somebody who fixes motorcycles for a living and waves at the mail carrier every single day. I was wrong. Not a little wrong. Completely wrong. And I don't think an apology at a barbecue really covers 11 years of that, but it's what I've got, so I'm saying it in front of everybody, on purpose, so it counts for something." Dale nodded, accepting it the way he'd learned to accept most things in his life. without needing it to be bigger than it was. "It counts," he said simply. "Thank you for calling me that night. That's the part that mattered." The gathering loosened after that, conversations picking back up, plates filling, the awkwardness of the moment folding itself back into an ordinary afternoon. But something on Sycamore Street had shifted, quietly and permanently, in a way no banner or casserole dish could fully capture. Harold sat in his chair on the porch for the rest of the afternoon, watching his neighbors talk to Dale Whitfield like a man they were only now, finally, actually seeing. Craig Dobson's trial was still months away, the outcome uncertain in the details, but not in its general shape. A man who had chosen his own impatience over his uncle's life, and a padlock that had told the truth about him more clearly than any of his explanations ever could. Harold rebuilt his routine slowly over the following weeks, porch light off by 7, newspaper by 7:15, coffee on the porch by 7:30, though now Dale sometimes joined him for the last of those, sitting on the steps for 10 minutes before the shop opened, saying little, needing to say little. Karen walked her dog past every evening still, but she no longer crossed to the other side when Dale's motorcycle was in the driveway. Some mornings she stopped to talk. It wasn't friendship, not yet, not fully, but it was something honest, built from a phone call she'd almost talked herself out of making, and a man who'd never once needed convincing to answer it. Dale never asked the street to change its mind about him. He'd simply lived the same way he always had, decent and unhurried, and paying attention to the people around him, whether anyone was watching or not. It had taken a padlock, a week of silence, and one honest phone call for Sycamore Street to finally notice what had been true about him the entire time. Months later, when Craig Dobson's trial finally concluded with a conviction and a sentence that kept him well away from Sycamore Street for years to come, Harold marked the occasion the only way he knew how, sitting on his porch that evening with 2 glasses of sweet tea instead of 1, waiting for the familiar sound of Dale's motorcycle turning onto the block. When it came, low and steady in the fading light, Harold raised the second glass in greeting before Dale had even climbed off the bike. "Figured you'd want to hear it from me before the news," Harold said. "It's over, really over." Dale sat down on the porch step beside him, taking the glass Harold offered. "How do you feel?" Harold considered the question longer than Dale expected. "Lighter," he said finally. "Not happy exactly. Just lighter." He looked out at the street, quiet now in the early evening, porch lights flickering on one by one along Sycamore. Eleanor always said people decide what they want to see. Took this whole street a locked cellar door to finally decide right. Dale said nothing, just nodded, watching the same street settle into dusk the way it had 1,000 evenings before, except that now, for the first time in 11 years, it looked back at him and saw exactly what had always been there.